installation, exhibition and that.
Yeah. So the work's been coming together over a number of years. And it started in an interesting way because, and I just want to tell you this, because so many of us in this country end up by emigrating or having to emigrate for various reasons. And it was at a time when I was living in London that I started thinking a lot more about certain things to do with history. And I started to feel that I'd really be interested in knowing or in trying to understand or unleash or, just unknot some of the things that were there that I found when I was in that, when I was in England. I found a lot of the time that conversations would go so far and then they'd get a little bit stuck or they'd get a bit stilted. And in some ways, I found myself wanting to bring the conversation much further, but sometimes it was through anger, and other times it was through frustration. And at times, I began to kind of take a look at that, because I went there thinking that, no, I'm an educated Irish person, I've been through kind of third level and so on. And in some ways, I have it all sussed, that was my feeling. But in fact, there was very little of it that was actually sussed. And when I started taking a look at where I was coming from, I felt that what I was hearing from people there, and maybe more in the south than in the north, which is also kind of interesting politically, but what I was hearing was something that I kind of termed a kind of a willful ignorance about where I was coming from or about my culture.
About Ireland.
About Ireland, yeah, and about our history and about how we are at the moment and why things happen. And so inevitably, for instance, we'd start talking about the north, and it would always end up by the same kind of, we'd regurge the same kind of conversation, and it was really frustrating, because I felt that, look, if we had a little bit more information about what had actually gone on, maybe we'd have a little more tolerance or a little more understanding of something. So in thinking about all these areas, I began to think that actually one area that was kind of sticking a little was the famine, because it seemed to me like a huge void. It seemed like an enormous black hole somewhere, a really dark kind of time. But it also struck me that maybe, whereas I had originally thought that some of that kind of stuff we were well past, it was our past, it was history, it wasn't anything to do with us at the moment, I began to think more and more, maybe it had. Maybe we are acting in some way, and it's a kind of, in some ways it's a kind of a famine of the spirit or a famine of the psyche. It's not necessarily, so some of the kind of research that I began to do or began to look into, some of the stories, began to be more maybe about some of those issues, about our psyche and about our hearts, or what, how we react to things, or how we deal with things as Irish people. And I began to...
Our sense of identity.
In terms of our sense of ourselves, yeah. And I began to see things like other peoples would behave in a particular, we all behave in different ways, but I just began to see patterns in Irish people, and I began to...
What type of thing do you mean by that?
Well, perhaps something about the way we put ourselves down, for instance. I've just done a workshop this morning here relating to the work, and we were talking about those issues with a group of women from Tala. And it's so easy. We find it so easy as Irish people to put ourselves down all the time and to take that negative stuff. And in some ways, these are hugely broad statements, but in some ways I think they are connected a lot to our history and a lot to us as a people and what we've been through or what's kind of gone on. So in some ways, I wanted to take a look at that kind of period, because again, I was also taking a look at history, wondering, well, what happened in different times? You go through the real golden age of Irish, saints and scholars, and it was incredibly rich when you start looking at it. And then you come to areas where it was really so poverty-stricken. You wonder, what happened this people? What happened this island? What happened this group? And without kind of trying to get bogged down in blaming anyone, I just decided to take a look at it. And I started reading a lot about the famine. And the more I read, the more I just felt, part of me felt very, very hard to continue reading it. It's not very easy stuff to continue reading or to continue taking a look at. But part of me kept saying, this is so valid. It's so valid to today. It's like it's like a whole wound, a wounded nation, a wounded psyche. That if we, in some ways, if I can manage to take a glimpse at that, then I think I'll be doing something interesting for myself anyway. And that's kind of interesting because I'm quite, not confident, but I've had such feedback from people about that, about those very issues, since the show has opened, or since I've started actually putting work out, presenting the work and showing people the work, friends and other people, that I do get that feeling from Irish people, that it is like that wound. And what's interesting for me as well is that it feels like people are ready to take a look at it. So maybe the timing is quite nice.
That's another thing I was
yeah.
Is it that you have the experience of in North America, the North American Indians would have very similar experiences in terms of their own
right.
ideals.
Yeah. Yeah.
You'd have the Afro-American community
having
a lot of the same psychological or identity kind of crises as Irish people would have.
Yeah.
Except for it feels to me that maybe we're that 40 or 50 or 60 years just ahead of those people in terms of our own identity.
I think that's true, and it's not, you see, because we're part, I think maybe that's another issue that I don't really know very much about, but my sense is that yes, we're part of a Western society, our so-called kind of Western, the Western world, or the Western group. And yet, in so many ways, actually, we're part of the developing countries as well, And I think that's kind of interesting in recent terms, in terms of what Mary Robinson or people like that were up to over the last while, because it's like, I think we can see, but I think that's powerful for us, because I think we're in touch with it. Perhaps, anyway, I'm not saying we are or we aren't, but perhaps we are in touch with it that little bit more than other countries around us. Because it is quite recent, and it is something that we haven't healed, and we're still touching on it, and it's still sore, it's still the wound, it's still something.
As an artist, okay, there are big and there's so many kind of ways that one could start to deal with something like that. So as an artist, where do you come in and start working on those ideas, and how do you go about, choosing the actual form that a show like this will take?
Right. It's very, that's an interesting question, because you read so much, or I have read so much, and I have got millions of stories, and in ways I wanted to use so many stories that I didn't get to use in this particular show, but that will get used in some ways. And a lot of the time I keep wanting to use words, but I don't find that I'm very good at using words. So I kept kind of putting them to one side and saying, my business is in visual images, and let's stick to that, or let's try and work those out. And I think actually a lot of ideas got worked out in sound, as well as in visual images, as well as in, trying to, it was like I had the intention of doing a lot of, I had 2 performances set up for this particular space that became inappropriate over the last couple of months to continue doing. But some of the gestures, some of the pieces of the performance in terms of sound and in terms of images got put into more stilled image, more, visual, straight visual work. But that also was very interesting for me, because it was quite challenging. I'd actually feel more comfortable in doing them live and doing them to an audience and in a space. But using...
Well, about the media and about using this particular...
Well, I'll tell you, I had a group last week or the week before, a group of Inchicore women here, and I thought my thinking on this particular room or these particular images was that they would find them interesting and pass on. They started sitting down, they wanted to stay here talking about them, because they had seen, like one woman started talking about how she had seen somebody on television using their hands, and the language for the deaf came up, and the whole language of hands came up, and of how you can use your hands as gestures, and how you see people, like we all know in this city that we pass people who are looking for something, looking for food, looking for money. And we're the ones that are on the other end. We can give, we can decide to give or not to give, we can walk on, and quite a lot of the time we're all quite caught up in that. We don't really know what to do. Nobody really knows what to do. A lot of us walk on, but we don't know what, we feel uncomfortable with that. And I think that's kind of interesting as well, because maybe we feel that it's actually quite close to us. In lots of ways that's quite close to us. It's kind of been felt by us at different times. But in terms of the actual images, she was interesting as well, because she was saying like how she was looking at the television and she was saying, yes, I could use my hands a lot more. And she was just talking about it, and as she was talking about it, she began to use her hands more. And it was lovely to see a lot of different women. There was about 18 or 20 women here, and a lot of the other women noticed, hey, you're using your hands as you're talking. And it was just lovely, because it was a very basic kind of reaction to the work, but it was very nice, just that feeling that it's actually, it's very simple in one sense. It's accessible. It's something that, that they could read very easily on one hand, in one hand, in one way. And so that was quite interesting. And to do with the videos was interesting as well, because I was unsure how people would read the video work. I thought that maybe I was putting, I kind of thought all kinds of things about it, but I thought maybe I was putting too many issues into it or too many ideas into it. And yet I knew that there were, like say the ideas to do with the seaweed or to do with breast milk. And you sit in there with a group of women, and you know that we've all been fed as babies. And you know that most of those women, because of their generation, have actually been breastfed. And yet, of course, it's a very complex issue, when you start talking about the ideas around breastfeeding. The piece isn't about breastfeeding, it's about abundance, it's about possibilities, it's about having, it's about choices. It's about other things which are related to a whole world that has those choices, and a whole world that hasn't got those choices, and that are being told that even if they have the resources within themselves, it's not good. They need to buy in resources from the Western world. So it's about all of those things as well, which in my mind causes the famines. They're the kind of things that cause the hunger of the mind, or the hunger of the spirit, or they're the kind of things I'm thinking about, really.
If you are painting or drawing or making sculptures, there's a lot of hands-on, a lot of turnover of the actual.
Yeah.
This, you're talking about really money being used up or being burnt up every time you go out. And as an artist, I think would obviously inhibit the development of an artist using this as a form.
I think these are very interesting questions.
And then, of course, on from that, then how does that impound itself in terms of the content of what you want to say?
Yeah, and how you get about doing it anyway. I find that really difficult. I find it incredibly difficult, because most artists in this country have nilch money to start with. And even the filmmakers talk about having nothing, but they start with something. And artists don't even know enough to, working in this medium, to actually start with something. I mean, I literally started with nothing. I was doing this project with nothing, with my own salary, so it was a ridicule. It's ridiculous. But I think that's my own problem, or I think that's our own problem. We have to take a look at that for ourselves as artists, as a group of artists working in this area. But I think the other ways that are interesting is that, for instance, I bought this tiny little, it's a really gammy camera. It's a compact VHS camera. But it's one of the best things I have, because the tapes don't cost very much, and I can use them ad nauseum. I can keep reusing them. And I do all my, what I call notebook work in something like that. So I do a lot of work on, like, all the images that you see here is on kind of the sophisticated beta, and the most expensive tape and camera work and editing facilities that you can use. I still know very little about it, but that was the way I ended up by using the material. But in fact, it was originally shot with this compact camera, for nothing, like for nilch. It's just like using a Polaroid or something. And then deciding, God, that is interesting. I like that. I like the way that's... And then it had to be reshot and reshot. And the more I learn about it, the more I realize that really I need to go to the good stuff. Maybe not in the first place. I really like the idea of having something that I can grasp, that is just goes on my shoulder. It nearly goes in my pocket. It's so simple to use as an artist. It's like having a pencil.
Pauline Cummins has used video as part of her work here, and she had a show earlier this year, and we talked about this. And I said to her, what interests me about the way the technology and the prices of the technology is that there is actually equipment that's coming within the range of ordinary people's kind of pockets. So I'm just kind of interested in what do you think that artists might do, having access to things that normal narrative storytelling with these cameras won't do or hasn't done? One thing I found interesting was that Pauline filmed the inside of a mouth, And I think other than probably films on dentistry, nobody had ever asked him
dealt with that area.
So I think because in a way the reason why I say this is that I'm very interested in the 1920s in Germany and in Europe and what artists did with cameras.
With the cameras that they had then.
Where the cameras were taken off the huge tripods. And in a way it's like taking these moving cameras. And I'm just interested what your feelings about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's the same difference as knowing that I have the facility inside myself or the resource in my belly to make the sound before I go into the 24-track studio to make the sound. Do you know what I mean? It's the kind of same difference. It's like knowing, it's like, you know, I know that equipment is really important to have, and I know that it's really important to have the money to use the best facilities for artists, and they have a right as much as anybody else has, and more so a lot of the time because they've got more things to say, maybe, you know, a lot of the time than the TV crews and so on. But I still think that it's incredibly important for us not to get hung up on the equipment, because, you know, it's accessible. It's, you know, if not that it's accessible, but that if you use the equipment that is accessible, you'll actually find yourself really using it to its limits. And sometimes those limits are a hell of a lot more interesting, actually. But I'm not using this as an excuse, do you understand? You know, but I'm just saying that sometimes those limits actually bring you places that are quite interesting. And when you go there with your little gammy camera, like I've gone to hell and back with this little compact camera. And so it wasn't a problem when I was faced with a camera that could do everything for me. I said, you know, I was able to make decisions quickly and I was able to take it in my stride. Whereas a lot of the time we're inhibited by this kind of scenery, you know. So in those ways that was quite interesting. But I also think as well, there's another point, because this came up in a discussion with young people once, where they were a group, and I mean, I'm projecting where they came from, but I think it's fairly clear projection. They came from a background where they would have seen a lot of sophisticated television. A lot of them would probably have computer games at home and that kind of facility. And when we were talking about video and being able to make video, you know, we were talking with people from some of the better companies in Dublin, better being bigger, I mean, companies in Dublin, who were talking about how much it cost to shoot a U2 and how many cameras they had. And really, that's all very fine, you know, and that's interesting as well. I find that interesting. I find it fascinating more than interesting. But when I started talking to them, I wanted them to know that the electricity for the bulb that I was using at that time cost, you know, 30 pence, and something else cost £3.60. Do you know what I mean? I kind of wanted to make it so that, yes, they, a 13-year-old, can actually get the hold of going somewhere, or can use their imagination so that they're not prevented from doing something creatively with a camera because they don't have all the accessories. And I think that's kind of important, you know, for us to hang on to, because not all of us have that.
In terms of viewing something, do you think that there's a very different relationship between the way people will view work like this because of their familiarity with something? I've just observed people watching the thing, and people are very absorbed in it, but it's hard to know exactly how much that is because it's so familiar that they're I don't know. Have you any ideas?
Yeah, I do, because up to this, I would have made work on video, and I would have made it with much less facilities than I've used here. And so in a lot of ways, I would have stretched people. Like I was working with an editor who didn't want to use a lot of my material because it was a he, and he was just so used to working with good quality material, and he really, you know, his name on it. He just didn't want to work with anything that wasn't really clear, clean material. So it was kind of interesting because it set up this whole friction where it's my piece of work and I've taken the best I can and I need to work with that. And my way of working up to recently has been that, okay, I can live with somebody looking at something that's maybe slightly bit jittery, but that actually has the sound there, or that has the voice, or that has the openness of what I'm trying to say, or that has the rawness of what I'm trying to say. Whereas he was saying, no, God, you'll lose your audience, you'll lose, you know. And so it was great because I think what actually happened was we ended up with something that maybe people, like the general public, find it slightly easier to look at. It's not as raw as something I would have edited on my very own. But it's also kind of more juicy in a way. You know, it's more kind of, it's slightly easier looking, easier viewing, if that's, and that's something I feel still a little uncomfortable with. But I think it's true that it is slightly easier viewing than I would normally make work. And that was working with somebody outside of myself, and that kind of relates to the question that you had about, you know, artists, some artists working on their own in their own situation and being able to just relate to themselves, and others who need to use an editor and use facilities and use, you know, so that was, but I think at the end of the day, it's made the work richer in that sense as well, you know, and I'll be clearer the next time as to what I really definitely want to hold on to and what I can let go, or, you know, so it's interesting from that point of view as well.
But then what about the elements then?
Okay, so
why did you put these elements? Why did you put them?
Yeah, some of the things I'd like to just say a teeny bit about in terms of the video is why things came together, you know, and the feeling that I had about the famine, because some people have come and, okay, so anyway, the feeling I had about the whole issues around the famine were, because the whole issues are so grueling and they're so, you know, they tear your heart out, and but they'd also shut you down. You know, it's very hard to kind of make, you know, in one hand, it's actually very hard to make work about those issues. You're making them about terribly real things for people, and it's not so long ago in our terms or in people that we meet here, you know. But when I started, some of the things I was kind of curious about was beginning to look at why famines might exist, or how they begin, or what causes them, the kind of causes of them, and the situations of them, and beginning to understand that it had really very little to do with food, and in lots of ways, so there were lots of complex issues around that, but it really was very little to do with actual food, having food and not having food. But in thinking about some of those issues and hearing about how people existed and how people died more than existed, you know, just very, like, terribly simple things, like I read about how people died with, and the verdict was that they were found with lumps of seaweed in their belly. And at the same time, here I was, you know, walking with my child beside the sea, looking at this most exotic, beautiful, rich seaweed, rich in colour, and knowing, although I'm not knowledgeable about seaweed, but knowing that it's rich in content and rich in, you know, in all kinds of ways. It just, you know, not knowing why I included the seaweed, it had to be included. You know, it just had to be part of it. And in the same way, it's like a lot of the, you know, so that's a very simple thing, and you know, there's nothing else about it. But it's like, again, including the jellyfish, for instance, and I wanted to include elements like the jellyfish and like the fossils, and like things that are part of our background that are very rich, but that also have a kind of an existence that's way beyond a life or a death, that's way beyond something like that. Like how long does a jellyfish live, you know? What's the life of the jellyfish? I didn't go into all these details, but it's actually incredibly beautiful and powerful when you start looking at a jellyfish in a pool. And I started looking at this one because I wanted to film it. I just decided that this is an ancient thing. This is something that's actually very precious to us. You know, this wee jelly here, you know. So it was funny, but it was also incredibly powerful, because this jellyfish that looks like a nothing, you know, was bringing me around the pool and around and around and around, through all these currents of air and currents of water. And I was beginning to realize that the kind of knowledge I have is so limited as a human being, you know, that it's like, I just knew that the jellyfish had to be included. You know, that kind of information, or that kind of, not information, but that kind of opening of the mind has to take place in order for us to understand something outside our own culture. You know, so the jellyfish got included. And it also seemed interesting because the jellyfish came out of the breast milk, and it just, you know, visually it was just exciting. They were exciting visual images to use. So, but there were also lots of other reasons, you know. But, you know, so the reading of that is interesting from my point of view, and it really doesn't matter that, you know, I take you down a journey down the back of a whale. It doesn't matter whether it's a whale or whether it's a piece of planet from some other planet, or it's a piece from some other part of our own planet. You know, that's not what the issue is. The issue is that I'm taking you on that journey, or you're taking yourself on that journey visually. You're being brought from somewhere to somewhere else, and it's not necessarily through mileage or through space. It may be through something else in your heart, or in your, you know, in the atmosphere that I'm creating. And that's really what the whole piece is about going on a journey. And it's about being brought, you know, not only through the whole, because a lot of people look at the video work and say, my God, it's so rich. And it's true, it's very rich, because I decided that was a whole part of what I wanted to show, is that immense richness. And that kind of richness and value is everywhere. It's not just in this country. It's like it's a whole worldly thing. You know, and sometimes we're just in situations where we can't see it, you know, or where it's blocked away from us for different reasons. And so those kind of issues I'm interested in as well. And out of some of those issues then came the idea that the unblocking is perhaps to do with some decision, or some responsibility, or something really deep inside ourselves, and something that we can do for ourselves or use for ourselves. And so my way of getting that out is quite a lot of the time through my voice. It's through kind of releasing something, and it's breathing. And some of the sighs, for instance, I mean, they came quite late in the piece, but then they seemed incredibly important, because the more I was looking at something, I was sighing really naturally. But I caught myself sighing, and I think, no, you know, that should go down, because I keep sighing when this piece comes up. Why is this, you know? And so I know very little about the ideas of sighing, but somebody who was looking at the piece, who's a psychiatrist, I think, started saying, you know, sighing brings you much deeper into into yourself, or, you know, and he started to explain this, and it was just very interesting that's, you know, without knowing, this is what I was doing. I was bringing myself deeper into that area, you know, that I was trying to think about. So it kind of became interesting from that point of view as well, you know. And just in terms of the voice work, it's interesting as well, because I did a voice workshop with a group of women this morning, and some of them had already seen the work, and some of them hadn't. And one woman at the end of the workshop said to me, and she was a woman who was actually finding great difficulty and embarrassment in making any kind of sound amongst us all, said to me during a cup of tea afterwards, she said, well, I just decided at one point that I was either going to do it or not do it, and I thought, Asher, to hell, I'll do it. And she ended by making the most powerful sounds. It was really very moving for me to hear it, you know, because she ended by just making this wild, free, but very wild and very deep sound. You know, so it's like, what I'm also saying is that it's within all of us to do that, you know, tying back in with the work, or tying in with any work that we do.